an architecture media podcast supported by the Australian Institute of Architects, produced on Boonwurrung country.
Welcome to Design Speaks Weekly, a podcast that explores the biggest stories in Australian architecture and design. I'm your host, Georgia Burks, and today Isabelle Toland, Director at Aileen Sage Architects, and Andrew Nimmo, Director at Lahznimmo Architects, discuss lessons and experiences in managing fees and procuring work for architectural practice. But first, here's the latest news headlines from Architecture AU.
In the news this week, a design team led by Durbach Block Jaggers with Architecture Associates and Openwork has won a competition to design a new $60 million library and public piazza in Melbourne's Coburg. The winning design was unanimously selected in a two-stage competition that launched in May 2025. And in regional Victoria, Geelong's new Convention and Events Centre has reached completion, with fit-outs and testing now in progress ahead of its scheduled July 2026 opening. Designed by Woods Bagot, the project features a 1,000-seat theatre, exhibition spaces, conference facilities and a public plaza. And lastly, the City of Perth has unveiled a new 10-year strategic plan developed with urban design firm Gell to improve public spaces and transport links as the city prepares for significant population growth. The plan includes 5 major projects to boost connectivity and enhance the city's livability. Those are the headlines for this week. For the full stories and more news, visit architectureau.com. I'm Adair Winder. It's Tuesday, March 17.
Commercial viability and creative ambition in architectural practice are a constant balancing act, even more so in this time of economic uncertainty. However, this tension is not unique to one generation. As part of the 2025 Design Speaks Architecture Symposium, What's Next for Practice, Isabelle Toland, who co-founded Aileen Sage Architects in 2013, and Andrew Nimmo, who co-founded Lahznimmo Architects in 1994, spoke about the business of architecture, focusing on fees, procurement, and starting their own practices. It was great to understand the similarities and differences that their respective studios experienced as they evolved over the years. And it was such an informative conversation that we wanted to share it with our Design Speaks Weekly listeners. We start today's episode with Isabelle asking Andrew, what is it about public projects that interests him? I hope you enjoy it.
So in the preparation for this conversation, we realised, I think, that both of our practices have focused quite heavily on delivering public projects, which I think has been quite interesting. So why public projects for you? What's your interest been?
I think to begin with, Annabelle and I originally came from Queensland. So when we came down to New South Wales, we didn't have an old boys or old girls network or parents' friends to get those early projects from. Plus, in the offices that we had worked in, we had been mainly doing public projects. So it felt like a fairly natural progression. But at the end of the day, I've got to say, I love public projects. There's something rewarding in that's architecture at its very best, because you're producing something for the broader public. It's not one person's obsession. It's not one person's glory house. It's for general use. And I think there's a lot of satisfaction in that. Plus, on public projects, the briefs are really interesting and really challenging. They're different on every project. The whole process of building up the brief and communicating with the client is great. I really enjoy that. I think it actually brings out the best opportunities for doing architecture. And you?
Yes, I think similarly. So Amelia and I both met each other when we were working at Neeson Merkert Architects. So around 7 years prior to starting our practice, we worked together on many different projects, from private residential to public projects. But projects like Prince Alfred Park, which we both worked on the entire time that we were at Neeson Merkert, I think really inspired us to want to continue those conversations. And I think we saw wanted to build on those opportunities and the learnings that we'd had from that experience, especially with the City of Sydney as a client too. And I think, that crosses over a bit with some of our projects too, the City of Sydney as a client too, which comes with very much with its particular challenges. But as you say, they are a great client too in the sense of ambition. So I think this is a challenge though too. The complexities of public work is probably what attracts us to it too. I think having so many different clients in the broader public, that is incredibly diverse, and then also so many stakeholders too. That makes it very complex, which is why I think probably those formative years of working for practices on projects, on other public projects, probably help us as well when we do start and put ourselves forward for projects like this too. So as you mentioned, though, there are all these different ways of procuring public projects. We're all put through the ringer a little bit if we want to try and get into it. So how, in your 30 years of practice, how have you managed to survive through that? And where have you found the greatest successes or failures in it?
Yeah, look, I've got to say, doing submissions and winning projects is a soul-destroying process. And many times you're thinking, this is it, I'm not doing one more, and then you turn around and do another one. Look, as I said before, I actually think in terms of procurement process, it's not the procurement process that's the problem. It's obviously the fees. And we're finding on so many projects that we've come second or third, and it's because our fees have tipped us over. And you kind of think, wow, this is such an important project, and it's this big budget, and you're going to choose second or third best because of fees. So that's always a frustration. But if we can actually get in there in a short list, in a competition, then your chances are far better. And if it's that sort of process, you would hope that they're not just selecting on fees. I know one thing we chatted about was that when you first start your practice, and you're keen to get any kind of a work, I think that's when you perhaps do cut your fees because you just need to get some work. And I think,
Or you just don't know any better
or you don't
necessarily,
know
which is
better.
why I think, and why I tend to emphasize this drawing on knowledge of others is so important when you get out there too, because yes, you'll have sort of not so many records of your own practice and how much it's costing you, how long you're spending on things. So if you can draw on that and build, that's where I think you start seeing the value once you've been running your practice for a while. You see how long it's actually taking you to deliver things, and you can kind of accommodate that more. But as you say then too, with fees, say, because we're accounting for time too, if we need to try and compress the time and we're conscious of that, we can also manage our fees to a degree, but we need to do that consciously. And that's where I think I'm saying having done a lot of thinking before helps. The more thinking you've done before you start a project, the more you can do things more quickly, which is an obvious thing, I think. But we also then started talking about fee scales. Is that a good thing? Could clients provide more of a range, let's say, that we could all be aiming within so that we know that it becomes less of a focus of how you win a project?
Yeah, I think clients actually setting fee scales it has a lot of positives. We said we used to do a lot of work for the University of New South Wales, and they had a series of their own internal fee scales that they'd set up from their pre-qualified list. And when you compared them to the old AIA fee scales, they seemed incredibly low and disastrous. But the difference was you knew what the fee was up front. You didn't have to do a submission. You were just given the project. Here's the brief. Here's the fee. Go on with it. And you're not going to make a lot of money out of those projects, but they pay for themselves. They keep you busy. They keep good experience going on in the practice. And yeah, I often say to clients this funny dance we do with submissions about fees. You kind of think, well, how much you got to spend? Tell us all that's the fee, and then just pick the architect who you think's the best. And I'd much rather do that and work for, could be quite tight fees, but at least you're not in this second guessing game because you can do it for a low fee, you can do it for a more fee, you just do a slightly different process. But to think that you miss out on a project just because you didn't guess the right number can be very frustrating.
But we kind of need to roll that out then across a broader range of projects then, because that managing your fees becomes problematic because you're trying to cover, all of the amount of time you're investing in all of these submissions that you're not
Yeah.
getting any fees on. So if we, can reduce that amount of time more broadly across projects, then that helps us, as you say, focus on the actual work and just doing the job as well,
Yeah.
rather than
I think
trying to win the work.
I think also with both our practices, because we are very small practices, and I don't know about yourself, but we've never had aspirations to turn into 50, 60, 100 people. We like being, fairly modest scale, because you can still do some reasonable sized projects at our scale. But what it means is that you can't carry projects. And I know a lot of the big practices might have their trophy projects, and they're quite happy for them to lose money because that's where they get their reputation, they get their awards. And then they've got these other projects which are in the back pocket and you don't see them, and they make a lovely profit on those. We can't do that, and I'm sure you can't too.
No.
If we are trying to run a business. If we don't, then at the end of the year we shut up shop. So every project's got to earn its own way, and I think that's a big
Mm.
difference, and it makes you very careful and astute about how you're doing your fees.
Yes. And I think there is an agility in smaller practice, and probably why we are seeing more and more collaborations turning up, like with other architects and MBW working together, and Co-op working collaboratively as well with Philip Arnold. And, there are lots of these collaborations happening. I think it's because people are, you can control and take more responsibility when you're a smaller entity, and deliver more work, more efficiently, I think, and better work ideally.
So when you want to propose to bring in other collaborators, whether they're art collaborators or things that perhaps don't necessarily fit into our list of required sub-consultants, how do you convince the client that this person is going to add something?
This is a
to
good
the
question, and
project?
something we're still a challenge for us consistently. And I think we are getting more traction with that, more because we've persevered. And I think that's the thing I'm saying with perseverance, why that's so important, because you're not going to get there when you want to. And that's been a huge frustration, I think, for Amelia and I. And that's been the great thing of having a collaboration that is the foundation of our practice too, is that we sort of pick each other up when one of us is starting to feel a little bit, downtrodden. And I'm assuming as well for you too, it's great to have that person that can reinvigorate you and remotivate you as well. So I think we've persevered, especially with, say, clients like the City of Sydney. We used to throw in quite often a few, extra people, but we've found ways to sort of build them in. And through conversations, we realised that, just saying this person will add value isn't necessarily, they're not necessarily going to believe you straight up, and I can see why. But we had to sort of progressively take on smaller projects. Say with the City of Sydney, we've done a lot of projects with them that have been much more strategic or experimental. And it was through that process of building the relationship. Obviously, it's a very big and complex client too, but you do build relationships with individuals. They start to understand why you're suggesting the things you are. And if you can show that value progressively over time, then you start getting the opportunities to build those people in, and finding ways to enable those creative collaborations that I think bring the richness to a lot of our projects.
Yeah. I also think back to when we first started our practice, where it was all about getting work built, and we weren't really thinking about day-to-day fees, and providing there was just enough in the bank account at the end of the fortnight pay, then we felt like we'd been doing very well. I think there was a point where suddenly, as we did grow a bit and we had more, I suppose, more professional sorts of clients with much more demanding projects, where we needed to bring a bit more business acumen into our practice, and actually doing proper timesheets, measuring those timesheets against each project and the fees on that project, so you have this continual review, so you can actually see which projects are winning or losing in terms of money, and actually running it a bit more like a business. Because I know we all like to think that we're artists, and there's a very strong artistic element in our work, but we are running a business. And if you're a business, say with Tonks Zuleika, who are now 40 people but still doing wonderful work, that's running as a business. It's not running as an art collaborative. So,
But I think
that's
even
an important thing.
artists need to have better business acumen.
Yes,
We realise
yes,
that
they
too.
do.
And we work with a lot of artists as well. And part of that is trying to get our artists to really appreciate that they need to also run themselves as a business too. Otherwise, they can't support their creative practice as well. And helping, find ways that they can balance a very diverse practice too is something that we're very interested in and love doing. Another conversation we had was around how the best projects can sometimes come from the least glamorous of briefs, or, the least glamorous sounding projects. Do you want to talk a bit about that?
Yeah. I think every project has an opportunity to be a great project. I mean, you have to at least start that way. And for example, the project we did for Powerhouse out at Castle Hill. Now, that was originally gauged to be a shed to store some items in, and the most exciting thing was that we had to keep humidity and temperature within a certain range. And we were originally briefed along those lines. They said, "Look, we've got all these other sheds. We love these sheds. Can you give us a shed like one of these?" And we thought, okay, well, we'll try and do something nice with it, but we didn't have great expectations. Then the CEO changed, and Lisa Havilah came on board. And no, she wasn't interested in that. As far as she's concerned, everything had to be fantastic. It had to be beautiful. And she shifted the entire project. Now, wasn't that we suddenly got money thrown at it. The budget didn't change, but the attitude changed. And that went from being a very kind of just, a dull utilitarian building where we're trying to do something special, perhaps for where the people were working, into these incredibly involved discussions where she would come into our office and we were going through every single material. We're going through renders and animations on our computers to talk about it. And it became a fantastic experience. Now, she drove us crazy at the same time because she was so demanding. But as I was saying, that it's not the procurement, it's the attitude of and the brief of the client, and that working together makes such a big difference. But you've had that with City of Sydney too.
Yes, absolutely. Well, yeah, similarly, when 119 Redfern Street was an accessibility upgrade, it was inserting a lift into a building, really. That was the brief. So, but it did happen to be a state heritage listed building, a Victorian Italianate, very colonial building that had been purchased by the city for Aboriginal community use. And the client understanding that there were a lot of complexities involved in that was fundamental, I think, to being able to understand the much greater potential of the project beyond what was otherwise an accessibility upgrade. Same thing with public amenities, I think, but I think we could probably talk for a long time. I think we have a shared love of public toilets, but that's perhaps another conversation.
Public amenities is a great topic because
Next
I mean, we've got 5 minutes, haven't we? Right? Yeah, yes.
It'll be longer than that.
Yeah, we'll get together later to talk. But I mean, to me, I always see public amenities as the smallest civic building. And if you think 20 or 30 years ago, it was a reviled typology. They stank, they were soggen, they were dark, they were dingy. Nobody loved them. And now, for most councils actually understand that to build a public amenities on a square metre basis is probably one of the most expensive buildings you can build. So you don't have those silly conversations about, we can only do it in Pessa block and then paint it every time it gets graffitied. And they're actually taking pride in it. And now there are a lot of young architects. I mean, I actually think in New South Wales and Sydney, we probably have some of the best public amenities in the world because there's almost this little subculture has grown where each council's trying to outdo each other. And young architects are getting a bite into public architecture through the public amenities. I think it's great.
I think so too. But I will premise that with saying as well, as architects, we shouldn't always see it as our big break too. As much as we've benefited from that being one of our first little public buildings too, that was actually won as a consolation prize to a much bigger and open EI that we got what was seen as the much lesser project in this whole delivery of many public toilets that the city was looking to deliver. And that ended up being 2 public toilets for us that got built where the others actually fell away because there were too many complexities with the other sites. But we also have been presented briefs by National Parks, for instance, as a client where it was a rollout of their existing amenity standards with an existing design. But working with them and working out how to turn that into something a little bit more joyful and then realising that there was potential of that. I think this comes back to our conversation of realising that actually some of the most mundane briefs can be turned in. It's all about the client and I think their perception of what the project is as well.
I think that's a wrap, is it?
Thanks for listening to this week's episode, which is supported by the Australian Institute of Architects. If you're enjoying this podcast, be sure to subscribe, share, or leave a rating. I'm Georgia Burks, and this has been Design Speaks Weekly. Design Speaks Weekly is produced on Boonwurrung country. We acknowledge the traditional custodians of country throughout Australia and recognise their continuing connection to land, waters and culture.